Okay, so I'm going to introduce the man of the evening, internet strategist and broadcaster. You've probably heard him on the radio, where that lovely voice goes on and on. He's a broadcaster, technology columnist for the CBC Radio. He owns and operates, as I've said, 2 companies, Open Flows Networks Limited and MetaViews Media Management. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Jesse Hirsch.
Thank you, Tina. Part of the idea for today's event, and certainly why you're seated in a circle and why I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes spinning round and round until I get dizzy, is, we're not here to do a lecture on McLuhan. We're not here to do a panel presentation. As I warned many of the people I knew as they walked in, this is meant to be a participatory seminar. It's very much designed for us to not only talk about McLuhan, but to talk about Toronto, in that to celebrate the sort of 100 years of McLuhan's birth. I think it's important that as a city, that was in the context of perpetually failing technology, it's important that we be adaptive, that we change, that we evolve. Now, really, to give you a bit of background for myself and my own relationship with McLuhan, when I was in university, I found a home at the McLuhan program. It was a place where people who were interested in thinking about different ideas, who were interested in tackling the internet, media, technology, were able to have really far-out discussions, really blue sky discussions. And I benefited from that, quite personally and professionally. And so what I wanted to do tonight was to try to recreate that, to do it over 3 nights, this tonight, 1 in August and 1 in September, that really talked about McLuhan's contribution to the city and the way that the city, I think, has evolved, the way the city has been unique. So tonight, it's to really look at the past. And by the past, I don't necessarily mean the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. I mean yesterday, last week. In that I think all of us, whether we were born in Toronto or we came to Toronto, there's something about this city that's special, that's unique. So what I want to do today is talk about this notion of the city as classroom. The idea that media creates environments, that cities create environments, and Toronto as a media city is particularly unique, both in terms of incubating McLuhan's own work, but also what came afterward. So what I want to do really is have a conversation, facilitate a conversation. And part of the way I'm going to do that today is help from a couple of my friends, a couple of my colleagues, who I'll now introduce you to. Luke Simcoe, who's on the left, and Daniel Joseph, who's on the right, are 2 graduate students who I'm going to briefly allow them to talk about a little bit of the work that they do. But I think they really embody the kind of modern notion of communication scholarship. So they're going to spend the evening going around the room with a microphone, looking for people who are perhaps ready to contribute, looking for people who are ready to participate in the discussion. And after they give both a brief intro, I'll explain to you what the topic is, what the questions are, and elaborate so that you have a sense of what it is we'd like to accomplish tonight in terms of a conversation. And while some of you may have entered the room not realizing that it was participatory, not realizing that you were expected to actually contribute. Let's be frank. I was born in 1974. I came to Toronto in 1982. I wasn't even here when the guy was alive. So clearly I need help to really understand what Toronto was like, what Toronto became in all its many cultures. So I'd like to take a moment, if you guys could come into the middle here briefly and just share with people the work that you do, and perhaps they'll get a sense of why I've asked you to moderate.
Perpetually working technology. Hey everyone, I'm Luke Simcoe. I'm a master's student in the Communication and Cultural Studies program at Ryerson and York Universities. I'm working on a thesis right now looking at how certain emerging online communities, notably those attached to 4chan, if you've heard of it, or the hacktivist community Anonymous, are inserting themselves into sort of the debate about what the internet is, how we use it in our daily lives, and what it's going to look like in the future. So that's just a little bit about what I do, and as as communication scholars, McLuhan is always sort of kicking around, and he's central to the work in one way or another. And so we're sort of intimately familiar with him, and I've been reading him whether I wanted to or not for going on 6 years at least now. So, and I guess, I don't know, I was born in '83, and I came to Toronto in 2009, I guess. So yeah, so I've got even less experience, so we'll need even more help, and so we'll need even more of you to talk. Thank you.
Is this working? All right, well, okay. Or maybe, okay, well, whatever, we'll roll with it. So I'm Daniel Joseph. I'm also a graduate student at the Ryerson's Communication and Culture program. Okay, we'll just do that. All right. I'm also a graduate student in Ryerson's Communication and Culture program. I'm finishing up my MA thesis right now. It is about how, it's about industrial cultural regulation and how the government actually influences and helps develop and incubate small game companies making video games here in Toronto. I'll be finishing that up in the next month, and then I'm going in to be a PhD in the same program at Ryerson and York University. So in kind of reference to McLuhan, I've actually just recently cracked open Understanding Media once again, and it's been something that's kind of, you know, in your first year cultural studies or communication studies course, they normally kind of introduce you to what McLuhan is, and then they kind of talk about Innes and then McLuhan, and then, you know, and then you kind of, it falls to the back seat a bit. And now, kind of on the verge of me starting a PhD, I've actually decided to come back to him and kind of reintroduce myself to his philosophy, to his ideas, because he thinks in very poetic ways, in ways that kind of open up the mind. And again, kind of in keeping with Luke, I'm also a recent move to here in Toronto, so it's something that I've been very interested in as learning about him kind of not in the city and then coming here to see kind of the influence and the kind of way he's held up in the community and the fact that you can pull this many people out to one event where supposedly you're not going to talk, but now you are, and to kind of learn about him in that way in kind of the context of the city. So again, I'm also calling on you to please talk and remember and think about ways that you've heard about him and think about him inside the city, because I'm new and I'm kind of learning as well, so I'm excited to hear what you have to say. So we'll let Jesse start talking once again.
Thanks, Daniel. Now, what I'd like you to do is try to capture Daniel or Luke's attention. Over the course of the evening, they're certainly going to look for you. If you look as if your face is deeply involved in the content, they may put a microphone in front of it. If you look as if you're fidgety, as if you're having problems with what people are saying, they may approach you and ask if you'll join the discussion. Now, to go back again to what we're looking at, I want to hear more about the Toronto that McLuhan was part of. I mean, would he have come up with the ideas he did if he was not exposed to Harold Innes? Was what was happening in Yorkville something that influenced him in terms of his perception of counterculture? Could Rochdale have existed had not McLuhan himself started a more radical approach to looking at pop culture and counterculture? These are questions that I ask because I was not able to be there, but I certainly hypothesize that there was a symbiotic connection. Moses Neimer, as someone who obviously created a reputation for Toronto around the world, was clearly influenced by McLuhan's ideas. And arguably the media industry in this country, in this city in particular, was influenced in thinking differently and finding innovative ways that I think is currently reflected in terms of the internet culture that exists, in terms of some of the companies that Toronto really doesn't get a lot of attention for, as we're overshadowed by Kitchener-Waterloo or Ottawa or New York or San Francisco. So part of what I wanted to do here is to recapture that, to not only celebrate Toronto, but recognize that there's something to the secret sauce of this city, something to the water, even if they are debating defluoridation or however that phrase may be. Nonetheless, there's something about the culture of this city that I think makes it possible. For myself, I mentioned I came here arguably 1982, right after McLuhan's death, where to me the notion of a media city, going from Northern Ontario where we had 2 channels to a city where there were tons of channels, tons of newspapers, obviously influenced me in terms of my professional career and my interests. So I'm also curious to hear your stories about how you came to Toronto, how Toronto may have shaped your own understanding of media, your own understanding of culture and technology. But not to exclude, I'm also curious to hear if you were elsewhere. Maybe you were in Montreal, maybe you were in Edmonton, maybe you were in another part of the world. How did Toronto appear to you? Was there some connection in terms of whether it was McLuhan explicitly or whether it was Toronto having this particular cultural vibe, this particular cultural attraction? that brought you and attracted you to this city? That's the conversation I'd like to have today, and the reason we're having it here is there's something fundamental about libraries, about public space, that I think really allows us to have these conversations when they're not ever being had. I mean, within my own sort of activism work, I talk a lot about why haven't we had a royal commission on the internet? Why is there this dramatically changing phenomena that impacts society, and yet we don't talk about it? We don't have conversations on how it changes us. And that's part of what I want to accomplish with these seminars, is a broader discussion on how as a city, as a culture, we relate to this technology. Now, granted, it's always difficult to go first. Certainly that's part why I threw Daniel and Luke out as kind of sacrificial lambs to break the ice, and they were quite willing, thankfully, to come out and to be so forward. So there's a number of people who I've asked, friends of mine, to come and share their own experiences.